The morning shift at Station Omega-7 began like any other day in the past 300 years. Automated systems hummed quietly as they processed the endless stream of criminals from across the galaxy. Each prisoner would spend exactly 24 hours in virtual containment, experiencing what felt like months of carefully designed rehabilitation. The system had never failed. Not once. Tom Bradley sat in the transport shuttle, his hands bound with energy restraints that buzzed softly against his wrists. The human smuggler had been caught red-handed with a cargo hold full of illegal quantum drives, and now he was about to face galactic justice. Around him, other prisoners from various species sat in similar restraints. A blue-skinned Altarian murderer stared blankly ahead. Two reptilian Voss pirates argued quietly in their clicking language. None of them seemed particularly worried about what awaited them at the prison station. Through the shuttle's small window, Bradley watched as Station Omega-7 grew larger. The massive structure looked like a mechanical flower blooming in space, with countless docking bays and processing centers arranged in perfect geometric patterns. Ships arrived and departed constantly, delivering prisoners and picking up the supposedly reformed criminals after their 24-hour stays. "First time in virtual containment, human?" asked the four-armed guard sitting across from him. The Vorthak's voice carried the bored tone of someone who had seen thousands of prisoners pass through these same doors. His name tag read Officer Kef, and his multiple eyes barely focused on Bradley as he spoke. "Yeah, first time getting caught anyway," Bradley replied with a slight smile. He had heard stories about virtual prisons from other smugglers, but none of them could describe what the experience was actually like. Most said it felt completely real, that you forgot you were in a simulation until the 24 hours were up and you woke back in the real world. The shuttle docked with a soft thud, and automated systems began the prisoner transfer process. One by one, the criminals were led through sterile corridors lined with holographic displays showing rehabilitation success rates. The statistics were impressive. 97% of all prisoners showed measurable improvement in moral reasoning after their virtual experience. Repeat offenders dropped to less than 2% galaxy-wide. Bradley found himself in a processing chamber filled with alien technology he barely recognized. Scanning devices mapped every inch of his body while other machines analyzed his brain. Patterns. The whole process felt oddly clinical, like being examined by a doctor rather than processed as a criminal. He noticed that the alien technicians barely looked at him during the procedure. To them, he was just another data point to be fed into their perfect system. Subject classification: human, male, approximately 30 standard years, announced one of the technicians to his colleague. Criminal history includes smuggling, illegal border crossings, and possession of restricted technology. Standard rehabilitation protocol should be sufficient. The technician's casual dismissal bothered Bradley more than he expected. He had spent years learning the tricks of his trade, developing skills that had kept him ahead of galactic law enforcement for nearly a decade. Yet to these aliens, he was just another routine case to be processed by their machines. A medical drone approached and injected something into Bradley's neck. The chemical burned for a moment, then created a strange tingling sensation that spread throughout his body. "Neural interface preparation," explained another technician. "The injection will allow the virtual environment to connect directly with your nervous system. You will experience everything as completely real until the program ends." As the drugs took effect, Bradley felt his vision becoming slightly fuzzy around the edges. The sounds in the chamber seemed to come from farther away, as if he were hearing them through water. He was guided to a reclining chair that looked more like a medical bed than prison equipment. Dozens of thin cables extended from the chairs. Headrest, each one tipped with a tiny neural connector. "The virtual environment will begin shortly," said Kef, now wearing the uniform of a processing supervisor. "You will find yourself in a survival scenario designed to help you understand the value of cooperation and following established laws. Most prisoners report the experience as educational, even transformative. Bradley wanted to ask questions about how the system worked, but the drugs were making it difficult to form clear thoughts. His vision continued to blur as the neural connectors were attached to various points around his head. Each connection created a small electric sensation, like tiny sparks jumping across his skin. The last thing he heard before losing consciousness was the hum of machinery powering up around him. Banks of quantum processors came online, their exotic matter cores spinning at impossible speeds to generate the computing power needed for a perfect virtual reality. The Station Omega-7 system was preparing to create an entire world inside Tom Bradley's mind, complete with physical sensations, emotional responses, and consequences that would feel absolutely real. In the monitoring room, technicians watched as Bradley's brain patterns shifted into the virtual state. His neural activity spiked briefly as the connection established, then settled into the steady rhythms that indicated successful interface. On their screens, thousands of data streams began flowing as the quantum computers started building his virtual environment. None of the aliens noticed anything unusual about the humans' neural patterns. The readings looked similar to other species, perhaps with slightly different electrical frequencies, but nothing that seemed important. They had processed humans before, though not many had ever been brought to Station Omega-7. The few that had been sent through the system had responded normally, showing the same rehabilitation results as every other species. As Bradley's virtual world finished loading, the technicians made their final notes and moved on to process the next batch of prisoners. Another routine day was beginning at the galaxy's most advanced correctional facility, and they had no reason to expect anything different from the human currently experiencing his first moments in virtual containment. The quantum computers hummed quietly as they maintained Bradley's artificial reality, unaware that they were about to encounter a type of problem they had never been designed to handle. The first sensation Tom Bradley experienced was cold metal against his cheek. He opened his eyes slowly, finding himself lying on the floor of what appeared to be a maintenance corridor. The air smelled recycled and stale, with the faint chemical tang of life support systems working overtime. Emergency lighting cast red shadows on the walls, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the steady hum of machinery. Bradley pushed himself to his feet and looked around. The corridor stretched in both directions, lined with pipes and conduits that carried various colored fluids and energy streams. It looked exactly like the kind of place where a prisoner might find themselves after escaping a transport ship, which he assumed was the point. The virtual environment was supposed to teach him lessons about survival and cooperation, but something felt wrong almost immediately. Bradley had spent enough time in real spaceships and stations to know how they should feel, and this place was almost right, but not quite. The gravity felt perfectly Earth normal, which was unusual for an alien facility. The air circulation created a sound pattern that repeated every 37 seconds, which seemed too regular for a real-life support system. Most importantly, when he moved his head quickly, there was a tiny delay before his vision caught up, like a computer trying to render new images. He started walking down the corridor, paying careful attention to every detail around him. The metal walls had a texture that looked realistic from a distance, but when he examined them closely, he could see that the scratches and wear marks followed mathematical patterns. Real damage would be random, but these imperfections were clearly generated by some kind of algorithm. Bradley reached an intersection and stopped to listen. According to the rehabilitation scenario, he should be hearing other survivors or perhaps hostile forces that would drive him to seek help and cooperation. Instead, he heard only the mechanical sounds of the station itself. He chose the left corridor and continued walking, but now he was counting his steps and measuring distances. After walking for exactly 200 steps, Bradley found himself in a small chamber with basic survival equipment, food rations, water recyclers, sleeping gear, and a computer terminal that would presumably give him information about his situation. This was clearly designed to be his base of operations while he learned whatever lessons the virtual environment wanted to teach him. He sat down at the computer terminal and activated it. The screen displayed a map of the facility, showing his current location and marking areas where he might find other survivors or useful resources. According to the display, he was on a remote mining station that had suffered some kind of disaster. His mission was to repair critical systems and coordinate with other survivors to restore the station to working order. Bradley stared at the screen for a long moment, then did something the system probably did not expect. Instead of reading the mission briefing, he started examining the computer interface itself. He clicked on menus, scrolled through lists, and paid attention to how quickly the system responded to his commands. Every interaction had a tiny delay, just a few milliseconds, but it was consistent across all functions. He opened and closed the same menu 50 times in rapid succession, timing the response each time with his internal count. The delay was exactly the same each time, which confirmed what he was beginning to suspect. A real computer would have slight variations in response time depending on system load and background processes. This computer responded with mechanical precision because it was not a real computer at all, but a simulation of one. Bradley leaned back in his chair and looked around the chamber again with fresh eyes. Everything here was designed to fool his senses, but it was still just a computer program. A very sophisticated computer program, but ultimately just software running on hardware somewhere in the real world. And every piece of software had limitations, bugs, and ways to make it do things the programmers had not intended. He stood up and began a systematic examination of his environment, but now he was looking for the signs of programming rather than trying to survive in a hostile facility. He dropped his food ration and watched it fall. The gravity was exactly one standard gravity, which was convenient for the programmers, but not realistic for a random mining station. He shouted as loud as he could and listened to the echo. The acoustic properties of the chamber were perfect, without the random variations that real spaces always had. Most telling of all, when Bradley moved to the very edge of his vision and looked at things from the corner of his eyes, he could see tiny flickers in the display. The rendering system was designed to focus processing power on whatever he was looking at directly, which meant the peripheral areas were generated with less detail to save computing resources. In the monitoring room at Station Omega 7, the technicians were beginning to notice unusual patterns in Bradley's neural activity. Most prisoners at this stage were focused on understanding their situation and planning their survival strategy. Their brain patterns showed the predictable mix of fear, confusion, and determination that the rehabilitation program was designed to work with. Bradley's patterns were different. His neural activity showed intense focus and systematic analysis, but not the emotional responses the system expected. He was treating the virtual environment like a puzzle to be solved rather than a reality to be survived in. The monitoring. Computers flagged his readings as unusual, but not alarming enough to require immediate intervention. Kef glanced at the readings from his supervisor station and made a note in Bradley's file. Some prisoners took longer to adjust to their virtual environment, especially those from species with strong analytical tendencies. Humans were known for their problem-solving abilities, so perhaps Bradley was simply taking a methodical approach to his rehabilitation scenario. Back in the virtual world, Bradley had moved on to testing the physical properties of his environment. He picked up objects and examined how they felt in his hands. The weight distribution was perfect, the surface textures were convincing, but everything felt slightly too clean. Real objects had imperfections, random variations in manufacturing, wear patterns that told stories about how they had been used. These objects felt like they had been designed by committee to be perfect examples of what they were supposed to represent. He found a piece of metal pipe and began tapping it against different surfaces around the chamber. The sound it made was realistic, but again, too perfect. The acoustic modeling was excellent, but it lacked the random variations that would occur in a real environment with real materials. Every tap produced exactly the sound that physics equations said it should, without the tiny imperfections that real physics always included. Bradley smiled to himself as he continued his tests. He was beginning to understand how this system worked, and more importantly, he was starting to see its limitations. The virtual prison was incredibly sophisticated, but it was still bound by the same rules that governed all computer programs. It had to make assumptions, use shortcuts, and optimize for efficiency. Those optimizations would be its weakness. He walked back to the computer terminal and began exploring its functions in more detail. This time, he was not looking for information about his mission. He was looking for ways to make the system work harder than it was designed to work. Bradley had been in the virtual environment for 6 hours when he made his first real breakthrough. He had spent the time systematically testing every aspect of his prison, treating it like a complex piece of software that needed to be debugged rather than a real place where he needed to survive. His approach was methodical and relentless, the kind of thinking that had made him successful as a smuggler in the real world. The key discovery came when he found a reflective metal panel in one of the corridor walls. Bradley positioned himself so that he could see infinite reflections stretching away into the distance, each one smaller than the last. In the real world, this would be a simple optical effect that any mirror could produce. But in a computer simulation, those infinite reflections had to be calculated and rendered individually. He watched the reflections carefully and noticed that they became less detailed and more blurry after about the 7th reflection. The system was cutting corners to save processing power, which made perfect sense from a programming standpoint. No prisoner would ever look closely enough at distant reflections to notice the difference, except that Bradley was not trying to survive in a virtual world. He was trying to understand how that world worked. Encouraged by this discovery, Bradley began looking for other ways to overload the system's rendering capabilities. He found that if he spun around rapidly while looking at the reflective panel, the infinite reflections would lag behind his movement for just a fraction of a second. The delay was tiny, but it was measurable, and it told him something important about how the virtual environment processed visual information. The system had to validate every image before displaying it to ensure that it matched the physical laws of the simulated world. If he moved too fast, the validation process could not keep up in real time. Bradley realized that if he could create enough visual complexity simultaneously, he might be able to cause more serious delays in the system's processing. He started experimenting with ways to create maximum visual chaos. Bradley turned on every light in his chamber and adjusted them to create complex shadow patterns on the walls. He scattered objects around the room so that each light source would cast multiple overlapping shadows. He activated the water recycler and several other pieces of equipment, creating moving parts and flowing liquids that the system would have to track and render continuously. In the monitoring room, technicians were beginning to notice that their computers were working harder than usual. The processing load for Bradley's virtual environment was climbing steadily, which was unusual but not immediately concerning. Sometimes prisoners went through active phases where they explored their environment extensively. The system was designed to handle that kind of activity, but Bradley was just getting started. He had discovered that the computer terminal in his chamber was connected to other systems throughout the virtual station. This made sense for a rehabilitation scenario where he was supposed to coordinate with other survivors and repair critical systems. But it also meant that he could potentially access functions that were not intended for prisoner use. Bradley began exploring the computer system's menu structure, looking for anything that seemed more complex than it needed to be for a simple survival scenario. He found maintenance protocols for the station's life support systems, diagnostic tools for monitoring equipment status, and even some basic programming interfaces that were probably meant to let him customize certain aspects of his environment. Most prisoners would use these tools to complete their assigned missions and learn the lessons the system wanted to teach them. Bradley started using them to create computational problems that would strain the system's resources. He activated diagnostic routines on every piece of equipment in the station simultaneously. He set up monitoring programs that would track thousands of different system variables and update their displays continuously. Each individual action was perfectly normal and within the bounds of what a prisoner should be able to do. But taken together, they created a massive computational load that the system had to handle while still maintaining the illusion of a realistic environment. Bradley was essentially launching a distributed denial-of-service attack against his own virtual prison using nothing but the tools the prison had provided for his rehabilitation. The strategy was working. He could see the system struggling to keep up with all the simultaneous demands he was placing on it. Menu responses became slower and less consistent. Visual effects started showing tiny glitches and artifacts. Most importantly, the careful synchronization between different systems began to break down as the computers prioritized different tasks. Bradley pushed harder. He wrote simple programs using the terminal's basic scripting functions, creating loops that would perform meaningless calculations over and over again. He scheduled dozens of routine maintenance tasks to run simultaneously. He opened multiple communication channels and set them to broadcast test signals continuously throughout the station's network. None of these actions would seem suspicious to the monitoring systems. To the external computers, it looked like Bradley was simply being very thorough in his exploration and management of the station's systems. The rehabilitation program was designed to reward that kind of systematic thinking and technical competence. What the system did not realize was that Bradley was using those same qualities to attack the program itself. As the computational load continued to climb, Bradley noticed that the artificial delays he had identified earlier were becoming longer and less consistent. The system was falling behind in its processing, which created small windows where his actions might not be properly validated before being executed. Those windows were exactly what he needed to take his attack to the next level. He had been probing the edges of the system for hours, learning its limitations and finding its weak points. Now he was ready to start pushing beyond those limitations in ways the programmers had never anticipated. The virtual prison was about to face a type of challenge it had never been designed to handle, and Bradley was confident that his human approach to problem-solving would give him advantages the alien programmers had never considered. In the monitoring room, alarms were starting to sound as the system's resource usage climbed into red zones. The technicians were confused because Bradley's virtual environment was consuming far more processing power than any single prisoner scenario should require. But his neural patterns still showed that he was engaged with the rehabilitation program, and there were no obvious signs that anything was wrong with the simulation itself. Kef stared at the climbing resource usage graphs and tried to understand what could be causing such unusual system behavior. The virtual prison had been running for 3 centuries without any serious problems, processing millions of prisoners from hundreds of different species. Whatever Bradley was doing inside his simulation, it was unlike anything they had ever seen before. At the 8-hour mark, Tom Bradley achieved something that should have been impossible. He had been systematically overloading the virtual prison's processing systems for 2 hours, creating computational chaos through perfectly legitimate user actions. The delay times in the system's responses had grown from milliseconds to nearly a full second, which in computer terms was an eternity. During one of his experiments with multiple simultaneous diagnostic routines, Bradley noticed something that made his heart race with excitement. While typing rapidly on the computer terminal to launch another batch of resource-intensive programs, his fingers moved faster than the system could process his inputs. For just a moment, the interface displayed raw code instead of the usual, user-friendly menus. Bradley stopped typing and stared at the screen. The glimpse had lasted only a fraction of a second, but he had seen enough to understand what was happening. The virtual environment was not just simulating a computer terminal for his use. It was actually running on a real computer terminal that had been virtualized and presented to him as part of his rehabilitation scenario. When the system fell behind in processing, the illusion broke down, and he could see the underlying reality. He began typing in carefully timed bursts, trying to recreate the exact conditions that had caused the code to become visible. It took several attempts, but eventually he managed to trigger the same processing delay. This time he was ready for it, and he could read some of the text that flashed across the screen before the normal interface returned. What he saw confirmed his growing understanding of how the virtual prison worked. The rehabilitation scenarios were built on top of a quantum processing matrix that used parallel computing to handle multiple prisoner simulations simultaneously. Each virtual environment was allocated a specific amount of processing power, but the system could dynamically shift resources between different simulations based on immediate needs. Bradley realized that this resource-sharing system was his way out. If he could create enough processing demands to overwhelm not just his own virtual environment but the entire quantum matrix, he might be able to access administrative functions that were never meant to be available to prisoners. The key was timing his attack to coincide with the system's regular maintenance cycles, when security protocols were temporarily relaxed. He spent the next hour learning everything he could about the quantum processing matrix through his brief glimpses behind the virtual interface. The system followed predictable patterns, running maintenance routines every few minutes to optimize performance and clean up temporary files. During these maintenance windows, user access controls were briefly bypassed to allow system processes to run with full privileges. Bradley began preparing for his assault on the system's core functions. He wrote dozens of small programs using the terminal's basic scripting capabilities, each one designed to consume maximum processing power at precisely the right moment. The programs were simple but effective, creating calculations that would force the quantum processors to work at full capacity while performing no useful function. At exactly 8 hours and 47 minutes into his virtual imprisonment, Bradley launched his coordinated attack. Every program he had written activated simultaneously, creating an unprecedented demand for computational resources. The diagnostic routines he had been running for hours suddenly shifted into overdrive, monitoring thousands of system variables and updating their displays in real time. Communication channels broadcasted test signals throughout the entire virtual station network. Maintenance protocols activated on every piece of simulated equipment simultaneously. The quantum processing matrix struggled to handle the massive computational load while maintaining the illusion of reality for Bradley and every other prisoner currently in the system. Processing delays grew from seconds to minutes as the computers fell further and further behind. In the monitoring room, alarms screamed as resource usage climbed far beyond anything the technicians had ever seen. But Bradley was not done yet. At the peak of the processing overload during a regular maintenance cycle when security protocols were bypassed, he executed the most crucial part of his plan. Using the brief window of administrative access, he rapidly typed a sequence of commands that should have been impossible for any prisoner to know or execute. The commands were based on his analysis of the quantum matrix's architecture during his glimpses behind the virtual interface. Instead of trying to break out of his virtual prison cell, Bradley did something far more elegant and unexpected. He accessed the user management system and began modifying his own prisoner record in real time. The virtual prison system was designed with multiple layers of security, but all of those layers assumed that attacks would come from outside the system or from prisoners trying to break through barriers. No one had ever considered that a prisoner might attack the system from within by masquerading as an authorized administrator during routine maintenance operations. Bradley changed his status from prisoner undergoing rehabilitation to system administrator performing routine maintenance. He modified his security clearance level to maximum access and updated his processing timestamp to indicate that he had already completed a full rehabilitation cycle. According to the system's own records, Tom Bradley was now an authorized personnel member who was cleared for immediate release. In the monitoring room, the technicians watched in shock as their computers reported that Bradley had successfully completed his rehabilitation program and was ready for discharge. The processing overload that had been driving their systems to the breaking point suddenly ended as the quantum matrix reallocated resources away from his virtual environment. According to every monitoring system they had, Bradley was no longer a prisoner requiring containment, but an administrator who needed to be returned to the real world. Kef stared at his display screens in disbelief. The readings made no sense according to everything he knew about how the virtual prison worked. Prisoners were supposed to spend exactly 24 hours in rehabilitation, learning important lessons about cooperation and following galactic law. Bradley had been in the system for less than 9 hours, but somehow the computers were reporting a successful program completion. Automated systems throughout Station Omega-7 began preparing for Bradley's release. Neural interface connections started powering down as the quantum processors prepared to disconnect him from the virtual environment. Medical systems activated to monitor his transition back to consciousness. Transportation protocols initiated to arrange his discharge from the facility. The virtual prison had never experienced anything like Bradley's systematic assault on its processing architecture. The human had not tried to break down walls or find hidden doors like other escape attempts in the system's memory banks. Instead, he had treated the entire virtual environment as a computer program and attacked it using techniques that the alien designers had never anticipated. As the neural interface began its disconnection sequence, Bradley felt the artificial world around him starting to fade. The walls of his virtual chamber became transparent, then disappeared entirely. The sensation was like waking up from a vivid dream, except that he was waking up into a reality where he was about to walk free from the galaxy's most secure prison facility. In his final moments in the virtual world, Bradley allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. He had solved the puzzle that no prisoner in 3 centuries had ever been able to solve. The virtual prison, meant for 24 hours, had held him for less than 9, and he was leaving as an authorized release rather than an escaped fugitive. Tom Bradley opened his eyes to the harsh fluorescent lights of the processing chamber, feeling the familiar weight of real gravity settling into his bones. The neural interface cables were already retracting automatically as the quantum processors finished their shutdown sequence. Around him, medical scanners hummed quietly as they monitored his transition back to waking consciousness. The whole experience felt surreal. Less than 10 minutes had passed in the real world, but Bradley retained clear memories of spending hours in the virtual environment, systematically dismantling the most advanced prison system in galactic history. His body felt rested, as if he had taken a brief nap, but his mind was sharp with the satisfaction of a puzzle successfully solved. Kef stood nearby with a data pad in his hands, staring at the readouts with an expression of complete bewilderment. The 4-armed supervisor had processed thousands of prisoners through this system, but never anything like what he was seeing now. According to every monitor in the facility, Tom Bradley had completed a full rehabilitation cycle and was cleared for immediate release. "This is impossible," Kef muttered to his colleague, a 6-eyed Setonian technician whose name badge read, Dr. Voss. "The system shows successful program completion, but the timestamps make no sense. How can someone finish a 24-hour rehabilitation program in 9 hours and 52 minutes? Dr. Voss consulted his own instruments, running diagnostic checks on the quantum processing matrix that had handled Bradley's virtual environment. "All systems show normal operation," he reported. "No errors, no failures, no security breaches detected. According to the computers, everything proceeded exactly as designed." Bradley sat up slowly on the neural interface chair, stretching muscles that felt oddly stiff despite his brief time in the system. He could see the confusion on the alien faces around him, but he also noticed something else. The automated release protocols were already in motion. Somewhere in the station's computer systems, forms were being filed, transportation was being arranged, and his personal effects were being retrieved from storage. "There must be some kind of malfunction," Kef continued, scrolling through screens. of data that made no sense according to his understanding of how virtual rehabilitation worked. Run a complete system analysis. Check every processing node, every security protocol, I'm afraid you won't find any malfunctions. Bradley interrupted calmly as he stood up from the chair. Your system worked exactly as designed. It's just that it was designed by people who think like prisoners instead of thinking like programmers. The aliens stared at him in confusion. Dr. Voss activated a recording device and began documenting what was clearly an unprecedented event in the history of Station Omega-7. Explain what you mean, human. How did you complete rehabilitation in less than 10 hours when the program requires a full day of virtual experience? Bradley stretched again and looked around the processing chamber with the analytical eye that had served him so well in the virtual world. Your virtual prison is incredibly sophisticated, he began, speaking as if he were giving a lecture to students. The quantum processing, the neural interfaces, the sensory simulation, all of it is remarkable technology that creates a perfectly convincing artificial reality. He walked over to one of the monitoring stations and glanced at the screens showing resource usage graphs that were finally returning to normal levels after his systematic attack on the system. But it's still just a computer program, and every computer program has limitations. The trick is not to think like someone trapped in a virtual world. You have to think like someone debugging software. Kef's multiple eyes blinked in sequence as he tried to process what Bradley was telling him. You treated the rehabilitation scenario as a programming problem? Exactly, Bradley replied with a slight smile. Instead of trying to survive in your artificial mining station, I spent my time figuring out how the simulation worked. Every delay in response time, every visual glitch, every computational shortcut your system used to save processing power, all of it told me something about the underlying architecture. Dr. Voss leaned forward intently. But the security protocols should have prevented any unauthorized access to system functions. How did you gain administrative privileges? I never tried. To break your security, Bradley explained. I just waited for your own maintenance routines to create windows of opportunity. Your system temporarily bypasses user access controls during regular optimization cycles to allow system processes to run efficiently. I simply timed my commands to execute during those windows, making the system think I was an authorized administrator, rather than a prisoner. The explanation sent a chill through the monitoring room as the implications became clear. If Bradley could exploit the quantum processing matrix so easily, then the entire foundation of galactic criminal rehabilitation was built on flawed assumptions. The virtual prison system that had successfully reformed millions of criminals was vulnerable to anyone who understood how computer systems worked. Automated announcements began playing throughout the facility as Bradley's release procedures continued their inexorable progress. His personal effects were being delivered to the departure bay. Transportation back to civilian space was being arranged. According to every computer system in Station Omega-7, Tom Bradley was a successfully rehabilitated former prisoner who posed no further threat to galactic society. This is a disaster, Kef said quietly, realizing the full scope of what had just happened. If word gets out that humans can escape from virtual rehabilitation, we'll have to completely redesign our entire approach to criminal justice. The AI Council has been planning to expand this system to handle all galactic crime within the next century. Bradley nodded sympathetically. I can understand why that would be a problem. Your system works perfectly against prisoners who think like prisoners. The trouble is that humans have a tendency to think like engineers when we encounter complex systems. We look for flaws, inefficiencies, and ways to make things work better. Or in this case, ways to make them work differently than intended. If to punctuate his point, the chamber doors opened and a transport drone entered to escort Bradley to the departure bay. The automated systems had completed all required procedures for his release, and there was nothing the confused technicians could do to stop the process without shutting down the entire quantum matrix and potentially harming other prisoners still in virtual rehabilitation. The good news, Bradley continued as he prepared to leave, is that this kind of attack requires very specific knowledge and skills that most criminals don't possess. You're probably safe from other species trying to replicate what I did. The bad news is that any human with programming experience could potentially do the same thing, given enough time and motivation. He paused at the doorway and looked back at the alien technicians who were still staring at their impossible readouts. You might want to consider going back to old-fashioned metal bars when you're dealing with my species. Sometimes the simple solutions are the most secure ones. As Bradley left the processing chamber and headed for freedom, he could hear alarms beginning to sound throughout Station Omega 7. The facility was going into emergency lockdown as administrators tried to figure out what had gone wrong with their perfect system. But for Tom Bradley, everything had gone exactly right. He had faced the galaxy's most advanced prison technology and solved it like any other engineering problem, proving once again that human creativity and stubborn logical thinking could overcome even the most sophisticated alien technology. The virtual prison meant for 24 hours had held him for 9 hours and 52 minutes. Close enough to 10 minutes, he thought with satisfaction as he boarded his transport shuttle. It was going to make a great story to tell other smugglers.